And then she says, "Have you done this before?" And I say, "Funny you should ask that because..." Wait, what were we talking about? Beginners. We all were one at one time. Some of us might still be one, and some of us spend a lot of time thinking that we might forever be. Writing in its early stages can be a very overwhelming process, and there are a lot of traps that beginners often fall into. So to help you avoid falling into those traps, let's talk about some common mistakes that beginner writers make and how you can avoid them. Beginning with mistake number 1, shoving too much stuff into every sentence. When I go back and read the writing that I produced 5-10 years ago, one of the things that strikes me is how much information I seem to try and want to shove into every single sentence. And a lot of other beginner writers seem to fall into this pattern as well. The sunlight glistened off the dew-dampened leaves as Horatio rubbed a careful finger along the edge of the knife his uncle had given him 3 weeks before, and that he had spent the whole morning sharpening in anticipation of the invaders that were expected to burst through the thicket of alder that stretched down the hillside below him towards the village that the barbarians had burned 3 weeks before on the very same day that his uncle had given him the knife he now held in his hand and had spent the entire morning sharpening. That thudding sound you hear every minute or so in the audiobook is the narrator's head crashing into the table because they are never given a chance to take a breath. Shortening sentences, breaking up ideas is important for both reader comprehension and prose flow. When I started paying attention to this in more professionally written novels, it occurred to me how short a lot of the sentences they use. Some authors use longer sentences, but generally the run-on massive sentence with way too much stuff shoved into it is something that good writers avoid, and you should too. Punctuation is your friend. It will not bite you. Well, the semicolon might, but... Next common mistake that beginners make, focusing on the big stuff rather than the small stuff. How much a reader enjoys your writing is largely determined by how it flows as they read it, how well you describe the setting and characters, how interesting and engaging the moment-to-moment events in the story are. It's not necessarily driven by how big your plot's climax is, or how intriguing your characters are, or how in-depth the world that you've built is. The reader will have a hard time accessing any of those bigger elements if you don't get the small things right. A lot of small things, like using commas to properly set off clauses in your sentences, or making sure dialogue attribution is clear, or writing a solid viewpoint, all have a large effect on how good your writing is. One of the biggest mistakes I made early in my writing experience was not focusing on this stuff. I put a lot more attention on developing characters and trying to make an interesting plot, and not enough focus on clarity and reader comprehension. The big stuff is fun to focus on, which is why everybody spends so much time focusing on it. World building, characters, theme, tone. But none of that matters if the readers can't tell what's happening in your scene, or they get jarred out of the story every 5 pages because your sentence structure sucks. Little problems will cause big issues in your novel, so don't overlook them in your writing. Next up, writing too much simultaneous action. This is a very specific piece of advice, and I considered lumping in a few other pieces of advice alongside it, but then that was kind of violating the main thrust of this piece of advice, so I chose not to. There's a difference between how you imagine a scene that you've come up with happening versus how you relate what happens in that scene to someone who didn't come up with it. When you imagine a scene, you sort of imagine a lot of things happening at the same time, at the same moment, because you know what's going to happen because you came up with that scene. However, the best way for someone else, your reader, to get that information is to be told it sequentially. They don't want to be getting information all at the same time. The archer braced themselves against the wall as they pulled an arrow from their quiver and knocked it onto the bowstring while glancing out the window. The action that you present needs to be presented slower than you think it does. Mashing actions together like this doesn't allow room for description. It leads to bloated sentences and does not give the reader time to absorb what is happening. It'll make the writing feel mechanical, and also there's a lot of little details that you're imagining that you're just kind of taking for granted that the reader themselves won't be imagining if you don't pause to describe things as they're happening. And the only way you can do that that effectively is to break up the action, to make it more sequential, to not describe too many actions simultaneously. Remember, the reader needs a chance to absorb everything in your story. Everything in it is unfamiliar to them. There's a balance between moving too slowly and moving too fast and not giving the reader the description and details that they need. Next common beginner problem, weaselly dialogue phrases. Common advice, which is very good advice, is that you shouldn't dump expository or other overtly explanatory information directly into the narrative of your novel. This is good advice, and to avoid this, a lot of writers, especially beginner writers, will move this sort of information to dialogue. This is better than just putting this stuff directly in narrative, but it often results in what I've decided to call in this video weaselly dialogue phrases. These are phrases that set up dialogue, which is really only meant to deliver expository information for the reader's benefit. If your dialogue begins with, "This means that," or "I think that," or "it's because," or "as you know," then that's a sign of dialogue which is simply meant to transmit explanatory information. "This means that we only have 12 hours before the evil elves can activate the crystal amulet. I think that what you said the other day really upset Bob. As you know, Bob, we only have 12 hours before the evil elves can activate the crystal amulet." Dialogue needs to sound natural to what the characters would say. It should be driven by character goals and motivations, by what they're trying to achieve, by what they need to get across in the conversation. It should not be driven by what the readers need to hear. If you've got a lot of dialogue that amounts to characters explaining things, or telling other characters what they think, or giving little history lessons to other characters, then that can be a sign that your dialogue is being written for the reader's benefit, and that can be problematic. And the last mistake that beginner writers make, listening to writing advice. That's right. The thing you've been watching this whole time was actually detrimental to your progress, just as I planned. Did you notice I mentioned falling into a trap at the beginning of the video? There is value to absorbing information, but absorbing information alone is not going to make you a better writer. You will become a better writer through application, evaluation, and deliberate intentional improvement. Information can guide that process. It can maybe make the process move a little bit faster, but it's not a substitute for that process. It's not a substitute for practice. We live in a time where there's more information available about writing or any other topic than you could ever consume. Purveying information is a very profitable thing to do, and the people who purvey it want you to consume as much of what they produce as possible. Please remember to subscribe. Practice is where your skill is built. No external information is going to produce an understanding inside of you. The light bulb going off, those moments where you understand how to do something, that happens on an internal level. Skill is built through application. Information can guide this, but the reality is you have to put the work in. No piece of content, no piece of advice, no magical formula that some dolt on the internet gives you is going to transform you from a beginner writer into something more. That comes through hours and hours and hours of practice. You are the only person who can do that. Part of becoming a better writer means developing a healthy relationship with the informational ecosystem that you are participating in. That means not consuming an excessive amount of content, not changing your plans on a whim every time you encounter something in a piece of content. It means making sure that you're setting aside time to practice. It means making sure that most of your focus is on practicing, not on consuming content. And yes, I am fully aware of the irony of me presenting this idea to you while also producing some of the very content that I'm warning you about. Am I the villain in this? I don't know. Maybe. Villains are kind of cool. Anyway, speaking of cool things, this video is about to cool off because we're at the end of it. I don't know if cool off is a good way to describe it. Anyway, I'd love to hear what you think about this video in the comments down below. As always, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.